Hello, this will be a partial redo of an older video from 2000, early 2017, because I included some clips from the Ghostbusters movie. I got it blocked in a lot of jurisdictions. So I'll be looking at these interesting connections, but also the bits I've added will extend on. So the importance, the use of numbers such as 666, and even more curiously the use of the number 1776 and how they can correspond in different architecture, important architecture by these important architects as well. So it's a not just a straight up re-upload, it's a partial redo as well. So cheers, and hope you enjoy. Hello, in this video I want to have a look at sacred architecture and sort out a little bit of fact from fiction, and well, a good connection will be the Ghostbusters movie. And when I say Ghostbusters, I mean the good Ghostbusters, the original Ghostbusters, not the remake. Now, remakes are always terrible, and why they keep doing them, I don't know. But I want to go back to the part one, the original Ghostbusters, and with the original cast in there. Now, again, this is what, so I'm going to try to sort out fact from fiction, and the fact is that this movie has, well, it's based on fact in a roundabout way. Now, here's some conceptual art of the movie. Now, if you do remember, in part one, all the activity was focused on one very important building. Here's another piece. So this building is not a real one, it does not exist, but it is based on not just a real building, it's based on a fusion of two real buildings. So here we see like a drawing and how it looked in the movie. Now I'll show a clip from the movie just to remind you, but again, this is not an actual building, this is a scene from the movie, and the clip will start in a second. And just to remind you of the building and the unique qualities of it. One of the clips I originally included was the scene where the Ghostbusters are in prison and they're talking about the very unique architecture and metallurgy of the main building, and how the architect was also a spooky doctor doing weird experiments, and they also reference the occult, and that there was these secret societies based around this particular Evo Shandor, they call him in the movie, but as we'll see, he's actually an amalgam of Harvey Wiley Corbett, Nicholas Roerich, and Lewis Horch as well, who are all Theosophists, Freemasons, and secret societies, esoteric groups as well. Okay, so this is Spook Central, as they call it, the building around which the Ghostbusters, original Ghostbusters movie was centered, and it's not an actual real building. Now here's like another, like a shot, and we see that the building itself is at 550 Central Park West. Now that's not a real address, but it's based on a real building. It was actually it's based on two real buildings, but we'll get to that in a moment. So, for instance, this is Central Park, and we see 55 Central Park West, and how it corresponds to 550. They've just added a zero to the end of a number. So that's at least one, that's the location, but there's a little bit more to it than that. I used some Ghostbuster clips in the original video, so I've had to, and I got blocked because of copyright. But there's that scene where the marshmallow man comes and then he climbs up the building, but before that he steps and breaks a church. And then there's that scene, nobody steps on a church in my town. So in the movie, how they're actually using 55 Central Park West, but they call it 550 Central Park West, and how they've blended that building with the master building by Harvey Wiley Corbett, and of course the Nicholas Roerich connection. So here we see a shot from the movie, the church in the foreground, and you don't step on a church in my town, as he said in the movie, but here's an actual real shot. So again, we see the church, and 55 Central Park West, the building itself. So the building has been so here we see a comparison: the top left corner, the real building, and the main shot, the church, and the augmented, adjusted movie building, which is at 550 Central Park West. The architects for 55 Central Park West were the firm Schwartz and Gross. I did a few other interesting buildings, and I won't go into them, but this 55 Central Park West on its own does fulfill some of the categories in regards to the spookiness of it. So not just for looks, but there's also another theme, a set of common themes running through 55 Central Park West, and as always, weights and measures confirm this. Now, for instance, at 222 feet high, please ignore the Wikipedia article because I just can't convert metric to imperial for some reason. I don't know why. But it's 666 hands, 37 fathom or 3,700 on the ionic scale. These are very important: 37, 74, 148. But we'll get to that. There we see the Ghostbusters building. And well, it's based on 55 Central Park West, but it's actually an amalgam of two buildings. On the left-hand side, in the black and white, that is 55 Central Park West. On the left-hand side, we have the master building on 310 Riverside Drive and Spook Central, or 550 Central Park West, in the centre. But as you can see, well, the bottom of the building is 55 Central Park West, but the top of the building comes from the master building on 310 Riverside Drive. There was a lot more to go into that, and we'll just have another look at it, the continuation of the scene.
Something terrible is about to enter our world, and this building is obviously the door. The architect's name was Ivo Shandor. I found it in Tobin's Spirit Guide.
In the movie, the architect is Ivo Shandor, but in real life, Harvey Wiley Corbett was the architect of the master building, which was one half of the fictional Spook Central building from Ghostbusters. But amongst other works, he also designed Bush Tower in New York City, which is 432 feet high, the same height as the Civic Tower, which is above the Masonic Centre here in Sydney. And he also designed the George Washington National Masonic Memorial in Virginia, which has all the measures, all the numbers in it as well. That was just like Bush Tower, Bush House in London was not by the Bush political family, but by Irving Bush, which was another family. But Bush House in London, former head of the BBC World Service. So apart from Bush Tower in New York City and the master building in New York City, Harvey Wiley Corbett was one of the key architects in this, and we'll go through some other ones. But the master building itself was built for the mystic and the theosophist Nicholas Roerich, a famous artist, author as well. And the building itself was funded by Louis Horsch, who was just like Harvey Corbett, was Mason. Louis Horsch was a 33rd degree Mason, I do believe. And just here we get a better picture, and we also see Svetoslav, the son of Nicholas Roerich. And so the whole family carried through with this very mystic occult aspect of their lives. But the master building by Harvey Wiley Corbett is doubly important because it will refer back to 55 Central Park West. But for instance, the master apartment building, well, 1776 Palm, a very important number. We'll examine that a little bit further later on. But on the Doric scale, it's 6,660 fingers, or 5,550 Ionic. Again, this is a nice connection to some other important Masonic buildings, such as Washington Memorial. But 55 Central Park West, 310 Riverside Drive, together they make the Spook Central building in Ghostbusters, and both of them have these numbers focused on 666, for instance, hands on 55 Central Park West, and 6,660 Doric fingers. You also might notice 74 and 148, how these carry through. This in itself is a very important connection to so many churches, so many monuments around the world. The architect of the master building, Harvey Wiley Corbett, did not start a society, not so secret society, in the 1920s. Nicholas Roerich started a society in the 1920s. And the master building was built for him and financed by Louis Horch. But so Ivor Shandor in the Ghostbusters movie is an amalgam of Nicholas Roerich and Harvey Wiley Corbett, just as the central building in Ghostbusters is an amalgam of 55 Central Park West and the master building. Now, Nicholas Roerich was a very famous author, painter, mystic, and he had some very powerful, very rich friends, such as Louis Horch, who financed the master building for him, originally the Roarick Museum, which is now just a few blocks up from the master building. The first 3 floors were originally a museum for Nicholas Roerich. So that's some very interesting, powerful friends. Now, interestingly, the son of Louis Horch, Frank Horch, was the manager of the master building until he was murdered in 1975, and I'll put the links to in the description, because there's a very good documentary I think is worth watching, Lapis Exilis, yes, and yeah, so link in the description, please watch, because it's very much connected to all of this, and some happenings in regards to the master building, some a relic, and the Jesuits, and some other organizations. Now, according to the investigation, anyway, the cornerstone of the master building contains a relic, which was for many years the Roarick family were in charge of, and depending on who you say, well, it could be the Pillarstone of Jacob, which is an important relic in the Solomon's Temple. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to these groups. And yeah, that's the cornerstone, and apparently in that cornerstone is this particular relic, and that's why Frank Horch was killed in the basement on the corner where that relic was. So the link will be in the description to that documentary. Please watch, it's really worth a look.
Let me guess. Gozer worshippers.
Right.
No studying.
After the First World War, Shandor decided that society was too sick to survive. And he wasn't alone. He had close to 1,000 followers when he died.
This statement is sort of true as well. Now, Nicholas Roerich didn't think that the world was too sick to survive after World War I, but he was deeply affected by it, because he saw the destruction of cultural antiques and relics and the cultural history of humanity. And that was his mission. That was why these people who were supporting him and gave him, gave him so much money to build the master building. Now, at the laying of the cornerstone, there were some very important people there, and a letter written by Albert Einstein was read, in which he praised the project and its goals. And one of those goals was to lead it in. Well, okay. Before I go, I've got a link in the description. The Einstein Tower in Potsdam, Germany, just an example, because Albert Einstein and so many of these people were firmly embedded in these secret societies, mystic traditions. It's in the weights and measures. Now, in 1935, the Roarick Pact was signed, FDR signing it in the White House. It was meant to be an international treaty for the protection of culture, cultural items, a lot like UNESCO. Some even call it the Red Cross for cultural protection. So this was one of the goals. This was because of World War I, it had such an impact. So as is often the case with Hollywood, it's sort of half true. So Ivor Shandor did not exist. He was a combination of the architect and the mystic, Harvey Wiley Corbett and Nicholas Roerich. The building did not exist. It's an amalgam of 2 known buildings, and Well, both of those buildings have more than a few things in common, especially through the weights and measures and the numbers. For instance, the use of 666 or 6,660. So, for instance, 55 Central Park West, which forms the bottom half of the Ghostbusters building, 222 feet or 660 hands.
Okay, so let's look at the number of the beast and 666. What you'll find now, in Revelations it's mentioned, but it's actually mentioned in not just the New Testament, but in the Old Testament. So, for instance, Ezra 2:13, when he's talking about the return from Babylon back to Jerusalem, it lists the descendants of each of the original exiles, and there is a long list of numbers there, but of the descendants of Adomicon, 666, but that is amongst a list of many, many other numbers. However, in 1 Kings 10:14, now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. A talent is an old measure. Some estimates vary, but around 72 pounds, and they're usually made into like a round shield shape as well, so that's another. But this was, I got these paintings, that's the entrance of Sheba, and so this is often said that this was a year after after Queen Sheba left. Solomon, 666 talents of gold. And of course Revelation, St. Paul 13:18, 666. This calls for wisdom. Let him who has understanding reckon the number of a beast, for it is a human number, and its number is 666. Even this, there are disputes over this, because some will say that the older one, I think in the earlier Greek ones, it's 616, and that in the old days, because Greek and Roman letters were also numbers, so they would play number games with people's names and with words, and like instead of a nickname, you would sometimes get a nick number, and that Nero was seen as a devil, and that the connection between the number games coming from Nero's name and 666, but it's mentioned before, but even in Revelations where it's referred to as the number of a beast, well, it is a human number in that sense. They know who is the beast. Humans are the beast. However, there are other. So this is Johannes Faulhaber. This is from Hidden Harmonies, page 159. And what is Master Reckoner Johannes Faulhaber not only discovered a different spatial generalization of the Pythagorean theorem, but saw how it would lead to a deeper understanding of 666, which he already knew was divine rather than diabolical. While the margins of our minds are too narrow to contain Faulhaber's Kabbalistic proof, we will unveil to you his rectilinear pyramid. So the book is Hidden Harmonies. You can read more on that. But so when he's talking about Pythagorean theorem, now for instance, we got 3, 4, 5, but for instance 666, 888, 1110, and it was again back then, for instance, Faulhaber. So this was an era of the 7 liberal arts in places like Chartres, Ulm, and in Cologne Cathedral as well. And again, you see sort of these classical Hermeticist geometrician imagery where they're depicted with this square and compass. So now this is from one of the pages of the Secret Symbols of the Rosicrucians in the mid-1700s, and again lots of references to the alchemists and to the mysteries and the geometricians, metrologists, and the sciences as it was before. They were more formalized and standardized in places such as the Royal Society, but now we see there 666 in here as well, 666 and 666, and like all over, and these, and like to the pentagram and the pentagon, and also well, our chemical symbols, sulfur and mercury and earth. So this alchemical. Oh, okay. I missed one there. So again, it's referenced over there, and you'll find it elsewhere. So there was a different. The way it was applied and thought about is a bit more different from, again, Hollywood and movies like The Omen, and have really accelerated this purely demonic sense of it, but it was seen in a different way and because of a different mathematical properties. Now, for instance, 660 is the 36th triangular number, so in other words 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 etc. all the way up to plus 36, and I think it's interesting to note that it's the 36th triangular number, so it's like 6 squared is a nice connect. Now even the way triangular numbers work, for instance 6 being the perfect of perfect numbers, because 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6, 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. Of even the perfect numbers, so for instance 28 is a perfect number, and that means that the numbers you can divide 28 by, such as 1, 2, 4, 14 and 7, well, if you add those numbers up you get 28. That makes it a perfect number. You can divide 6 into 1, 2 and 3. 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6, so it's a perfect number. But it's the only perfect number where you can also multiply 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. It's really, mathematically speaking, it's a really interesting number, especially in multiple dimensions as well. It has some unique properties in that way. But roulette sometimes said to be the devil's game because, for instance, 1 through to 36, so just like triangular number, it's a you add up all the numbers, you get 666. We'll come back to that because there's also a 37th number, which is a 0 on the board there. But back to those Ghostbusters. So, again, like a lot of the best stories come with at least a seed of reality to them, and so we saw the parallels in the Ghostbusters story to, firstly, 55 Central Park West, which was just renumbered 550 in the movie. It's being 222 feet high, which is 666 hands, or again. But, well, there are other interesting connections, because that's 37 fathom. Now, the master apartment building. So in the Ghostbusters movie, they talk about Ivor Shandor being a strange architect as well as a mystic occultist. What we really have is a combination of Harvey Wiley Corbett with Nicholas Roerich and all these intrigues that were happening around. So the main intrigues were not on 55 Central Park West, but the master apartment building on Riverside Drive. That's 444 feet, twice as high. And now if you apply in the Mason board, the Doric and the Ionic and those measurement systems, well, 444 feet or 1776 palm is 6,660. I didn't make a cart, might as well. Now, the average orbital speed of the Earth around the Sun, average is the minimum and then the maximum, but the average is roundabouts pretty much spot on to 66,600. So I didn't make the card for that, but Earth orbital speed 666 is as the average. So you have these two buildings, which again thinly veiled in the Ghostbusters movie in regards to Nicholas Roerich and the curious architecture. But one's 222 feet, the one's 444. You add them together, I think it's interesting that you get 666. But now we'll come back to 37 and 74. They both convert to 666, either directly on the imperial scale or all that, but 1776. So Declaration of Independence, 1776. But also the Bavarian Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt. I looked into this a while ago. I got old dictionaries and encyclopedias. Back in the day, the Illuminati was just in all the encyclopedias and dictionaries. They give a bit of a different story on there, without going into the machinations and interpretations and the various, let's just say, conspiracies. I wouldn't call it, it's the differing opinions in history, because it was Weishaupt was his original group, and very much in line with the Declaration of Independence. Now, for instance, you'll find in the original Weishaupt Illuminati things like separation of church and state, just like in the US Constitution, emancipation of women, universal education, and these other things that we now take for granted were actually what they were pushing. And back at that time, remember that the demonic Weishaupt Illuminati were still being, where you had the divine rule of kings and the unquestionable authority of the church as well. But that's not the point of this video, but we still have this interesting number 1776, which connects to, as we'll see in a moment, but I did a video series a while ago, Hermetic America, I think it was called. I go through all the state capitals, major public buildings, major memorials and monuments, and what you see is this, in this grand architecture, not just in the symbolic sense, but again in the proportions and the heights and dimensions of all the buildings, were all very carefully planned to bring you back to, again, these very important harmonic numbers. I did a series just on Washington, just a series on New York, but Hermetic America, I go through all the state capitals, and nearly all of them, not every single state, but again, it's just a clear, and not just in the more historic times, even, for instance, the North Carolina State Assembly building, both the old one and the new one, which is a modernist style, still incorporates all of these very important special numbers. But now, for instance, the length of the main halls in this building, California State Capitol, Sacramento, 222 feet or 666 hands. The Salt Lake Temple in Utah, 222 feet or 666 hands. And again, each of these, now the Salt Lake building, I'd even mentioned that in some videos, where it's just riddled with what you would, just on the internets would be generally referred to as Masonic symbolism, but pagan symbolism. It really goes back to not just Greco-Roman, you can also trace it back into Mesopotamia and Egypt, but certainly you see this, pre-Christian pagan symbol, and Masonic, if you want to call it that, esoteric symbolism all over these buildings. Again, highly architectured. They're not from IKEA buildings. They're designed very carefully, unique, very expensive, again, very bespoke, not like flat pack architecture. So that's again just like in Central 55 Central Park West or Spook Central in the movies. Washington Monument. Now if you look at the height has changed because engineers have redefined the way that you define the floor. So instead of being ground level, now the building height is defined from the top of the first step, sort of where you walk in, almost like lobby level rather than ground level. But 555 feet, and that's 6,660 inches. Again, really, I did a video very interesting building, again modern, and it's interesting how modern solutions to modern problems are going back to Euclidean geometry. Now, the building itself has all, again, the harmonic being 360 feet high, as all those harmonics, we're not including the conversions to Doric, Ionic, etc. But the floor space is 666,000 feet. But another, I mentioned the 6s and 5s, for instance, those hexagons and pentagons in the Rosicrucian symbol. Well, the problem with this building was it's very thin, so it's just a giant sail. It's very unstable design, and the way they solved that was, firstly you see the hexagon design and the triangles which give it strength, but the way they found out, either you bury too much of a building, it doesn't look like a circle, or you don't bury enough of a building and it looks too much like a circle and will fall over because it doesn't have a strong enough base. The way they solved that was to inscribe a pentagram in the middle, or a pentagon, and that defined what was the most efficient amount of the building to have in the foundation as opposed to above. So 6s over 5, a nice connection there. Manitoba Legislative Building, this is one of those, Frank Albo, but when they talk about sacred architecture, Winnipeg, but especially this building, now 259 feet on that's 777 hands. I've spoken before, but this Cremona scale, even the ancient, like Vitruvian Man, 7 feet actually make up the height of Vitruvian Man. It's 6 to 7 ratio, the meteorological relief in the Ashmolean Museum. Again, this ancient measuring device with a man, just like Vitruvian man, with his hands spread. There's even a foot inscribed on there, and the height of a man is not 6 feet, as should be ideally. It's 7 feet, so 666 hands on that Cremona scale, which is one of these older measures that just sort of disappeared from reference in the late 1718. While on the inside of the Manitoba Legislative Building, Frank Albo was gained access to measure, and he found that the entrance here is 66.6 by 66.6 feet, so a perimeter of 266.4, and that converts to 333 Doric span or Doric palm, but interestingly 370 Ionic span or 3330 Ionic inches. So again, it's where you see these very interesting sets of numbers and measurements coming together in these very particular buildings, which are often have their consecrations on important days, such as alignments of planets and so forth. So back to the the Spook Central, 55 Central Park West, which is just a fusion with the master apartment building, 444 feet, the other 222, and we see 30, but 1776. So again, the Declaration of Independence. So Freedom Tower in New York to replace the Twin Towers, 1776 feet, said to represent the year of the Declaration of Independence. Well, again, it just so happens that that converts to 6,660 Doric palm or 66,600 Ionic grain. So again, the Ionic and the Doric and these ancient measure systems just by coincidence bringing us to these important numbers. Now, I mentioned the average orbital speed of the Earth at the lowest, 66,000 miles or 108,000 kilometers per hour at the fastest, but the average 66,600. So that's a nice link there as well. But speaking of that, I've covered him in many videos. Just one of these rock star architects who just gets to prime jobs over and over is Norman Foster. And so 30 Mary Axe Street, referred to as the Gherkin, inside the City of London, in a very intriguing position as well. But that's 592 feet or 1776 hands or 6,660 Doric inches. Again, when you look at his buildings, his dimensions, his proportions, you always find the same thing. Why does he hit the jobs? Well, this is London City Hall, and it's 148 feet. Doesn't convert to 666, but again, well, with these panels, I'd like to, if I ever get to visit these places, I'll be counting, and I'm sure, as we'll see, because it's not just what's been built. You can also just look at the architect and the placement of these buildings, and you can predict a very small group of numbers will always be chosen. But 148 feet is 1776 inches, London City Hall. Architect Norman Foster, no surprise. Crystal Island in Moscow, it's a proposed building. Who's the main architect? Well, Norman Foster. And it's 1,480 feet. So again, you see these, even the geometry, again, one of these things, once it's completed, I'd like to explore, because it's just always there. Now, Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, not by Norman Foster, it's by another architect. Anyway, for instance, there's a lot of stuff, without breaking down the whole building, but one of the main features is this window, 148 feet high, so same number, but it's designed by I.M. Pei. Norman Foster, I.M. Pei, Daniel Liebskin, these other, the rock star who get the prime memorials, major buildings. I've got video, like Norman Foster was the chief architect of Astana. They've recently changed its name, but the capital of Kazakhstan, which is just Washington DC, Canberra, Brasilia, Astana. You could include London and a few other places, but these cities of power get always the same architects, same design, same themes, and more importantly, the same. Even though the buildings are of different height, they always choose a very specific height and width, and that bring you to these very interesting numbers. It's just repeated over and over. sometimes in the comments, or I've heard other people say, well, you can get a number to find anything. No, you cannot. You don't understand numbers if you believe that, because we're talking about set measurements. If it was true, well, you can get any number to find anything, well, I'll give you a measurement of a building and then tell you to find a random number. Now you won't. You'll only find those numbers which are built into the measurement. So this is, I don't know what it is. It's a sort of cognitive dissonance, I suppose, but it's just not true that you can. We're not talking about picking this number, dividing by how many jelly beans, multiplying it by the number of Volkswagens parked on the main road in a certain day. No, we're talking about specific fixed measurements. So it's just a silly argument, and I don't really understand. It's a cringe when I hear it being said. But IMP, again, many buildings, but the Louvre Pyramid, replica of the Great Pyramid, and at 5 to the 4th power is the ratio of size between those. But there is, speaking of 666, now there is a controversy over that at IMP and the Louvre Pyramid. Other people have covered it. I've done a few other little bits as well. Just the way it's designed is just built with this theme going on. IMP in an interview even says, like, reluctantly, that the golden section was a very important feature of his building. Again, covered him, Norman Foster and others, go through their buildings. You'll always get these very important, very special harmonic numbers, especially related to Pythagorean schools as well, and that have import in geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. It's just always there. You can't call that a coincidence. And old texts such as Vitruvius and architects who would be studying these things, well, it's just being passed on. If you don't know. But it's often said there are 666 panes or panels of glass in this building. You find many people who have looked at it, and so, for instance, some say there are 673. If you simply counting reveals that there are 673. Well, that's an interesting point. Now, this is just from the Wikipedia page. A story of 66 panes originated in the 80s when the official brochure published this during construction. It did indeed cite this number of being 666, but twice, a few pages earlier in the brochure, the total number of panes given was 672. So some get 672, some get 673, and there's a reason for that. There's also other people, I think 680. There's actually a few contradicting versions, and the problem is that the pyramid has this broken piece where you enter, and so it's easy on the outside because you just have these triangular panes covering the building, but then you have this entrance and you need to count those as well, and it's not easy because it's not just all these nice geometric triangles, and you have other shapes coming in. So it's a matter of what your method is and how you describe it. Now, I think there's another way to look at that as well. I'll mention in a second. Recently I did a video on 55, and there was a very similar pyramid here in the Botanical Gardens in Sydney, which is the height, and all the numbers are sort of embedded in there, and you can find it, all over Sydney. But again, when these architects work, it's not just if it's just in Sydney in a few significant places. You will find it in other very esoteric cities, let's call it, with in major pieces of architecture, not just some random shed, tool shed, behind around the corner. We're talking about bespoke, important, highly developed, very expensive architecture. But what you can do is you can now we'll look at the nodes. So what I mean by nodes is that when these framework intersects, I've just highlighted some of them rather than doing all of them, because there are 100, so there are 19 levels, which means that the easy way to do it is a 19th triangular number. So that would mean on this face alone there would be 190. Now, because each side is overlapping, some of them share, so the easiest way to do it, that's the 19th triangular number. The next panel, like around the corner behind, would be the 18th triangular number, because you can't include those that you've already counted on this side. So the 18th triangular number is 181. Then you go to the other side. Now you have to go down one again. So that would be the 17th triangular number, 153. And then we come to the face here, and you would have to reduce it again to the 16th triangular number, 136. So ideally speaking, if it wasn't for the entrance because the entrance is now cutting some parts of that out. There would be 650, but we are missing, the entrance is removing 3, 4 and then 5 nodes, so 12 in total. So there are 638 on the facade there. However, we come back to the problem, and I'd like to counter it and do there rather than rely on sort of people who I think are sort of good on them for, debunking is great and questioning and like, is this true? No, there's no higher principle to pursue. But we're missing at 638. We're 28 short of 666, and I would love to be able to visit for. Firstly, it's the Louvre. I'd love, but to be able to count the nodes, for instance, there in the ceiling and on the side, and how would you count the doorway? Because there's a revolving doors, but we would need 28 required to have 666 nodes in there as well. So, not saying it is. That's what you would require to get there. But again, given on the career of Ian Pay, Norman Foster, and these other and older architects, for instance, again, I've done really lots of videos following these architects, and they're always doing the same thing, not just Ian Pay and Norman Foster. So again, lots of videos on their buildings. It's just always there. It's not a coincidence. But back to 55 Central Park West, that's 222 feet. So we just usually think feet, yards or inches. We don't really consider the other divisions such as span, palms, fingers, for instance. But when you do, you will find that this re-emerges over and over. And now, for instance, the import of the number 37. So I mentioned 36 being 36 triangle number being 666. You add up all the numbers on a roulette wheel. There are 36 from 1, but it also includes 0. So there are actually 37 numbers on a roulette wheel, which I think is a nice link. And that's because I'll try to remember to link this video, how 55, well, again, all these really important numbers and measurements emerge from such as 55 feet and by these very important architects. Again, I'm not choosing a random building and then multiplying, dividing. I'm using the inherent proportions designs of these architects who are very influential. Norman Foster, Ian Pay recently, but going back through time, back to ancient Rome, where we have writings, but even going to, again, older buildings before, we have excellent records, and they have the same geometries and numbers built into them. So back to this is 55 Central Park West. You see it next to the church. In the movie, that's where the big marshmallow man steps on the church. In the movie, they show the entrance, and it's called 550 Central Park West, so we've just added a 0. But what you really that's the I suppose, was it a matte painting? That wasn't probably CGI in those days, but that's how the building was depicted. That's how it really looks, and that's the Riverside, 310 Riverside Drive, the master apartment building, which was the original building for Nicholas Roerich. This he set up the Roarick Pact, was to preserve and save cultural artifacts as well. So what you actually have is a fictional fusion of these two buildings. And so Nicholas Roerich, Theosophy, Louis Horch he financed this building be built for Nicholas Roerich to house his museum and these artifacts. Frank Horch, his son, managed the building until he was murdered in 1975 inside the building. And so now can I get that? Okay, master apartment building, built for Nicholas Roerich, Theosophy, funded by Louis Horch, Mason. The architect for the building was Harvey Wiley Corbett in the series I did on Hermetic America and New York. Again, look at his architecture. There we'll find, for instance, Bush Tower in New York City is 432 feet high. The cornerstone, very influential, very important ceremony there at Riverside Drive. That's where the son was murdered in the basement, and there is again this curious artifact that Nicholas Roerich had. Some call it the Pillarstone of Jacob. and the rumours regarding this include the involvement of Jesuits who were after this particular artifact. So I would think that the Ghostbusters movie, it's not too thinly veiled reference. I think they knew the story. This is probably like, it's spread as something like an underground urban legend. Best stories are based in reality, and that's what I think what is happening with the Ghostbusters movie. Okay, so that's the Esoterics of Ghostbusters. I think it's where the writers had heard of these stories, knew these people. Again, they're not really like the Roarick pack, which led to these cultural preservation treaties. The circle of people going around, again, no small thing, no small amount of money goes into these buildings, and I think, and again, it's where you see this architecture, mythology, symbolism, secret societies blending together, and at the very least they do make for the foundation of great stories. So whether it was the Da Vinci Code or the National Treasure series, even other, what was it called? Alias, I think. That's one of those J.J. Abrams movies. J.J. Abrams just blends, was it Lost, Fringe, Alias, even the Star Trek movie with the new one with Khan in it. Was it Cumberbatch fella? They just embed, the symbols make for great design and makes for a great story, but when you go back and look at the ancient origins of these legends and the numbers connected to them, and then when you look at this architecture, it's the real world is maybe not as, it doesn't have all the choo explosions and blow, and Michael Bay type explosions, but it is part of our history, and at the very least it's a good yarn just to sort of pick away, and just the architectural influence in modern times, Ian Payne, Norman Foster, or going back way back to the ancient times as well. So anyway, hope you enjoyed. This was a redo. I wanted to add some bits, especially with a 666, but also I got pinged for the because I included some Ghostbusters scenes in there as well, so I thought I'll sort of redo it and re-upload it. Hope you enjoyed. SGD, have a good one.